This is JavaScript from the ground up part 2. In the last episode, we covered a lot of the basics of JavaScript. In this episode, we're going to go into collections and some of the built-in behavior that you can find within the browser. So let's get started. Yesterday, we talked about the basic data types in JavaScript. The first thing I wanted to talk about today is arrays. So an array is a way to store a collection of other things. So you can store numbers, and so that is a set of the numbers 1, 2, and 3. I can store strings. I can store a combination of these things. And I can actually store other arrays. So if I do that, now I have one array, and if I click this open, you can see that it's showing me what's inside. Also, one quick thing, I'm hitting the up arrow to cycle back through, and then down to go back through them again, in case you're interested. An array is indexed, and I'm about to tell you what that means. So let's say we have this array of numbers. Like that. If I want to access an individual item, I can do that like this. So this is a syntax that you'll see a lot of as you develop. So arrays and many things in computer science are what's known as zero indexed. So the first item in the set can be accessed with the number 0, the second item with the number 1, so on and so forth. So we start counting at 0. I can also call attributes or methods or functions, however, I'm not sure what the exact title is, probably a method on our array. So if I call numbers, it's going to give me this arrow, which is pretty insightful. So I want to look at this. I guess it's actually an attribute here. It's this length property that I'm interested in. So if I do numbers.length, it's going to tell me there are 11. And so I can do this thing to get to the last element where I say numbers numbers.length minus 1, and the length is going to tell me the actual count, but remember we're 0 index, so like in this case, if there's 11 items, this last one is going to be at position 10. A side note, one of the really interesting things in the JavaScript console is if you type out your, well, really anything, and then you type a dot, like you're going to call a method on it, Chrome will predict pretty much everything possible that you could call on it. So this is a really interesting way to kind of learn everything that is built in that you can work with. So for example, push is a method that will let us add items. So if I just say push and then the number 3, for instance, I believe that thing that just got returned is the new length. So now if I call numbers, you can see that it has been modified and we've added the number 3 to the end. And the inverse of push is going to be pop, which you can see as soon as I type P, it's suggesting. And if I just type pop like that, it tells me which one got popped. Now if I look at numbers again, we're back to where we started. Alright, moving on. So that's arrays, and now you know how to call methods and start doing some discovery yourself with the JavaScript console. So that's cool. So the next thing I want to talk about is what's known as an object. So this in other languages could be referred to a hash, like in Ruby. But anyway, you type it with curly braces, and you've got yourself an object right here. Now, objects in JavaScript are a bit interesting, and they're pretty powerful. So let's start off with a super basic one that we can kind of see the standard. So like if we said Bob actually let's do user is an object, and we'll say name Bob, favorite color blue. Okay, so that's going to create an object, and I can access the attributes in two ways. So I can say user name, which this is kind of standard, like how to access a hash kind of stuff in some other languages. Same thing for favorite color. You can see that Google is trying to suggest it to me. I can't manage to select that, so whatever. Anyway, but you see how that works. The interesting thing to me here is that we can also do user.name. It's like it defines it kind of as a method automatically, which I find very cool. And it works just the same. So let's clear the console and let's create a new user object. And I'm gonna show you something that I find to be one of the more interesting features of objects. So if we say user equals first name Sarah, last name Smith. So what if we want to see the full name of this user? So this is kind of interesting, and let's start with a baby step, and I want to show you that you can actually attach functions to objects. So check this out. So we can do user dot say hi equals function console.log. I told you we're going to keep this really simple. Okay, so now if I look at my user, so there's just first name and last name, but then there's this say hi function down here. So I can say user.sayHi, and you can see that when I did that without parentheses, it did something kind of interesting, and it told us what the code in there is. So if I call it with parentheses, which is how you say you want to execute a function in JavaScript, it's going to print out hello. So side note, one thing that I'm doing repeatedly that I'm not sure if it's right or wrong necessarily is, obviously this is a function when we call it say hi, because it prints out the word function right below it, and we have to use the function keyword to define it. In some contexts, a function can be referred to as a method. Typically, that's in object-oriented programming. If a object knows how to do something, you would call it a method, whereas a function is more just like a generic piece of functionality. Since this is attached to an object, I would lean toward calling it a method, but I don't know what the exact correct thing is. So I cleared my console, and I still have my user, Sarah Smith, and we still have our say hi function. And I started working on a test self function, and I kind of messed it up, so I just cleared the screen and I'll try again. So I'm going to show you a new concept here. We're going to call this function, and all I want to do here is console.log something called this. Okay, so let's just run this. Maybe I should have called it test this. So it logs out the object itself, which is very interesting. So I want you just to make a mental note right now that this is an incredibly important keyword in JavaScript, and it refers to the object that code is being executed inside of, and that will become extremely interesting and powerful in just a moment. For the first thing, though, I want to just define a method called full name. So this is our first actually useful method. Function, and then we'll say return this dot first name plus, so we haven't really covered this bit here, but you can use plus not just with numbers, but you can also concatenate strings together with it, which in a nutshell, basically right here, we're just putting a space between these things. Okay, so let's try this. Dot full name. So here what we've done is we've basically taken two properties or two attributes on an object, and we've used them in a method on that object, which is really cool. So the last thing I want to do is go back to our discussion on the word this. So I'm going to go ahead and clear the screen. And this is going to leave you with some homework. So when we were inside of our object that we created, which was stored in a variable user, this referred to that user object when we were inside that function. But what about, and I made this statement that this refers to the object that code is executing inside of. So what about when I just type in numbers, right? What is that? What is that executing inside of? And so it's curious, if I type in the word this right here, I get this window object. And so our code is executing inside of this window object. And the window object refers to my browser window. And what's really interesting is if I open this thing, I get a ridiculous amount of built-in stuff that I can do. Which is, really, if you want to be a JavaScript developer, it's learning what all these things are in a lot of ways. It's just unbelievable all the different things you can access. So, for example, and we can start by saying, so you can access, in this case, you can call this and you can call window, and they do the same thing. So I like to call window because it's a little more explicit. But if you call dot, like we did earlier, and we just start predicting the different things that we can do, it's a little bit crazy. So you remember, I want to illustrate a point, is that we called full name on our user object. So we have user.fullname, right? And that's something that we defined. Well, window has a bunch of things, and it's really, the reason I walked you through this whole object thing is ultimately JavaScript is built on this sort of concept. And obviously window, if we look at user, it's a generic object, and window is a window object. So there's more to it, but it's a similar kind of idea. So anyway, let's look at our console.log. This thing here is ultimately, when we run this, it's executing, but what is happening really is that it's window.console.log. And it just knows that because we're not prefixing it with a different object, so we're not saying user.console.log or whatever, we're putting a bare function on it, it knows to send that to the window. So if I were to say help me, which doesn't exist, it's going to tell me that's not defined. Now it's not defined on the window, so I can do window.helpMe equals function, and I can say console.log help is on the way. Now if I say help me, it's going to actually call that function on the window, which is really interesting to me. So just to wrap this up, that is, when I said window.helpMe, that is identical in this case to saying help me. So one of the really interesting things is if you just write functions at this top level all the time, you can get into trouble for organizational reasons, because everything is just defined on the window and it's accessible everywhere. So if you want to think about neatly organizing code is when you get into objects and object-oriented JavaScript and that sort of thing. So the last point is that user is actually window.user, which shouldn't be surprising at that point. So the homework, if you want to call it that, is just to explore some things in this window object and just play around and see what you can find. So, for instance, if I call audio param, like I don't know what that does. I have not worked with that. So, pick something, explore it in the console, and then Google it and just see what you can find out. But anyway, that is it for this episode. In the next episode, we will be covering how to actually interact with the web page, and how to attach event listeners so that we can add some behavior to the pages we're using. But anyway, that's it, and I will talk to you next time.